The hygrometer screamed during the VIP tour as the storage door drifted open. A gilded frame leaned in the aisle like a drunk friend, and the Accession tag wasn't ours. I said, "Stop the tour," and the curator smiled as if I'd complimented the lighting. In the corner, the dehumidifier blinked 67%, the kind of number that makes paper curl and registrars swear. We were 10 minutes into showing trustees the backstage magic of the Harbour City Museum of Art History, and the painting at the end of the aisle was both the right size and the wrong everything. Our storage is a concrete cube at 118 Seabright Avenue on the port side of Harbour City, Massachusetts, a building that used to hold frozen fish and now pretends to hold time. We spend more on climate control than we do on parades. On the metal rack where HCMR 1947-11 should have been a 19th century coastal landscape with a lighthouse as thin as a violin string, there was a similar frame with a sticker on the stretcher. Lot 23, Atlantic Estates, 41824. I could taste copper. Our lighthouse had an Accession number written in my own clean hand in 2019, and this thing had a red dot from an auction house in Provenance. The curator turned to the trustees, voice warm. "Just a temporary loan for a comparison study. Let's move on to textiles." She put a hand on my elbow. I looked at her hand, at the chipped coral polish. I'd liked this woman. I'd defended her hires and her ideas. She was a star in our small world. PhD from the Courtauld, French mother, foraged mushrooms on weekends, an Instagram that made donors open their wallets like windows. She had a way of standing in front of a painting and making you think quiet was expensive. When she arrived 3 years earlier, everyone at the museum felt taller. We were a river city with salt in its teeth, trying to keep the roof from leaking and the donors from moving to Florida. She brought a show called Salt Silk Atlantic Journeys, and the opening night had oysters and a string quartet that played like they'd been trained in a ship's hold. She raised $1-2 million for a new gallery and a digital catalogue with brushed gold buttons. She rigged up stakeholder breakfasts where plumbers sat next to professors, and she charmed them both. The first red flag was that she liked every room too much. The second was that she could say Accession like a lullaby. I'm the collection manager, 19,000 objects, 92 aisles of shelves and sliding racks, a barcoding system I coaxed into usefulness, and a label maker I would save from a fire. Before the curator came, my job was part registrar, part mount maker, part therapist for anxious donors whose grandmothers had dusted things we now lock in boxes. After she came, my job got glossier and weirder. She wanted soft launches. She wanted moments. She wanted TikToks showing a 1770 sampler breathing in stable humidity. I didn't mind. I liked telling people why fiber needs darkness. The first time she made me nervous, it was over paper. In December 2023, a bleak month for non-profits, the board voted to sell 5 minor works from our study collection. 2 repetitive harbour views, a chipped amphora, a portrait nobody had loved since 1952, and a watercolour that had bled into its own mat. The proceeds would go toward conservation, an uncomfortable truth that registrars live with. We listed them at Atlantic Estates in Providence because the curator's friend there could do us a favour on fees. I prepped the Accession forms, condition, donor letters, Accession numbers in the left margin like bones. In March, the museum received 182,400 net. The curator smiled, bought nicer coffee for staff, and sent an e-blast about responsible stewardship. 3 weeks later, I found a second copy of a Accession form in our shared drive, same object, different signature. On ours it said Accessioned for sale by board vote 1/0723. On the second it said Accessioned for transfer to educational partner. The signature looked like hers, but the swoop on the R in her surname landed wrong, like someone practicing their own name. I asked the registrar, a quiet woman named Cassia whose hobby is mending lace, "Did you see this alternate form?" She shook her head, eyes going flat the way they do when danger smells like toner. "She asked me for a blank template last week," Cassia said she wanted to streamline. I suggested we keep a paper movement log again. The curator laughed and said, "We're in 2024. She hugged me for making the database searchable by donor temperament. It took me 24 hours to realize charm and control can wear the same shirt. Tension built the way tides do. In February 2024, a local family offered us a late 18th century map of the harbour by a cartographer named Ward. It showed a sandbar, long gone, and a warehouse we'd only ever read about in a ledger. The map lived in a cedar chest for generations, wrapped in a quilt and good intentions. When I unrolled it with weights, on blotter paper, under glass, the curator breathed like a soprano. "This," she said, "is our signature piece." She pitched the acquisition to the board, with slides that looked like hope. The price was $140,000, negotiated down by her to $108,000 with naming rights for the new case. The map arrived after a 60-day layaway with a donor's help. I put it in the map drawer, drawer 12, third down. I logged it into Past Perfect, HCMAH 2024, Error 2, I took a photo, I slept well. On April 18th, the same day the Lot 23 sticker showed up on a wrong frame, an advisor friend texted me from Providence, weird, an 18th CA Harbour City map just hammered for 68k. Doesn't your museum have one? He attached a screenshot, Lot 23, Ward, Harbour City, C, 1791. The curator had arranged a comparative sale, she said, to show market strength. Comparative meant ours was out of the draw that day, she said, to check condition against the market. I didn't like the verbs around check. The breaking point came under fluorescent lights while the board wore wool and pearls. I stepped past the trustees toward the wrong painting and knelt. The stretcher had a pencil inscription, HCMAH 1947, 11, my accession number. But the handwriting was a different century. The label was a sticker from Gallery Rivage, a place in New Bedford I knew because they once tried to sell us a fake weather vane. The corner of the label was lifted just a hair, enough to show another sticker underneath, Atlantic Estates Consignment. The curator said, "We will get there, I promise, but the textiles—" I stood up. "No, we're here." I pointed to the sticker, to the red dot, to the wrongness. The trustees turned, 7 necks moving like cranes. I walked to the map drawer. Drawer 12. The Ward Maps folder felt lighter than it should have. I opened it. Inside was a high-resolution print on cotton rag paper, inkjet, edges deckled, gorgeous enough to fool anyone who hadn't spent a decade with paper under their nails. In pencil, in the lower corner, someone had written, "Study copy." The graphite was fresh. My blood did the thing blood does when it prefers a different body. The curator stood very still. Then she did that smile again, the one she uses on cameras. "We commissioned a facsimile," she said, "for display, to protect the original. The original is in conservation." She unfolded a story like a sheet. I looked at Cassia. Cassia looked at the dehumidifier, reading 67. I said evenly, "Show me the courier receipt from conservation." She tapped her phone. "It's in my email." I said, "Everyone out." The trustees blinked. The board chair, a man named Edwin, who donated a lot of money and ends every email with gratitude for your stewardship, said, "Let's schedule a follow-up." I said, "No." He looked at the curator, who looked at him like a poem. "We'll go upstairs," Edwin said, and shepherded the trustees out with the competence of a person who's moved crowds toward endowments. When the door shut, the hum of the air system reasserted itself like governance. I turned to the curator. "Tell me where the ward map is." She sighed, sat on a crate. "Don't make this ugly," she said. Protagonist reaction, calm, methodical, not pretty, not dramatic, procedural. I opened a shared drive folder and took a screen recording, scrolling through the Accession forms for the past year, the movement logs, the registrar's notes, and the curator's emails. I filmed the wrong stretcher label, my voice saying, Lot 23, the red dot, the humidity reading, drawer 12, the inkjet's texture. I emailed the video to 3 accounts, my personal, our general registrar inbox, and a Gmail I use for Craigslist because I no longer trust single systems. Then I pulled the physical movement ledger out of the drawer where we keep our regrets and wrote, in pen, 041824 1012, Ward Map, HCMAH 2024-02, absent from drawer, facsimile present, pending verification. Cassia handed me a printed email. It was from Atlantic Estates to the curator's personal address. Consignment received. Ward, Harbour City, C, 1791, from CW Foundation, Lot 23, Reserve 50K. Attachment, a consignment form. Consigner, CW Foundation, 200 Fort Greene Place, Suite 7B, Brooklyn, NY 11205. The foundation, named after her initials. I looked up 200 Fort Greene, a mailbox's place. She said, "It's complicated." I said, "It's theft." She stood. Her voice hardened. "You think you know what keeps a museum alive? You think donors just give because they like your barcodes? This place survives because I make narratives donors want to be part of, because I renew their vows to this city. That map, do you even know who owned it before it was in that drawer? A family who let it rot in a chest while their kids snorted Cape Cod summers. I moved it into circulation. I sold 3 things nobody missed to get the textile gallery you cry over on your lunch breaks. I put this museum on a European itinerary. I did that." She stunned me with her honesty. Then she overplayed her hand. "I traded paper for oxygen," she said. "You're welcome. I called the police. Aftermath is all receipts. I called Harbour City PD from the office phone at 11:03 a.m. The officer on duty at records recognized my voice because I once found his kid's class visit list a lost mitten. I said, "We have a missing accession, possible consignment under a shell, and a fraudulent substitution." I need a report number. He gave me incident number 24-10387 and told me to sit tight. I didn't. I called the Massachusetts State Police Art Theft Unit and left a message. I emailed the FBI Art Crime Team because I have a folder of just in case with their contact. I CC'd our general counsel, who has the calm of a granite wharf and the billing rate of a yacht. The curator used the time to get ahead of me. She walked upstairs and did a quiet round of donor calls. Small hiccup, she said, just verification, trust me. She emailed the board, misinformation during a high-stress tour, we're on it. She CC'd the chair of the Acquisitions Committee, a retired judge who believes in punctuation like civic duty. She added a sentence about an overzealous staff member. That's me, I screen-capped. Cassia pulled vendor invoices from the past 9 months with the curator's initials in the approval field. Patterns emerged like mold in a damp corner. 6 wires to CW Foundation, totaling $98,700 for research services. A payment of $14,200 to Archivio Brugge for provenance research on a Dutch seascape the curator discovered in our study collection. The archive in Bruges spells its name with an S, and their invoices never arrive as Word docs. $6,980 in custom frames from Atelier Lusitano in Lisbon that arrived in crates stamped Newark, NJ. We printed bank statements. Incoming $182,400 from Atlantic Estates, the Accessions, outgoing $176,900 in wires to vendors with addresses that mapped to UPS stores and co-working spaces. We highlighted. We made a binder. People in museums respect binders the way surgeons respect knots. The curator wasn't stupid. She didn't put steel map on a memo. She put CW Foundation consultation on a line and had a board write-off 3 engagements for a total of $75,000. The foundation had one officer, her mother. The bank account for CW Foundation sat at a credit union in New Jersey. IBANs don't exist in the States, so her routing number wore its localness like Cologne. She had an LLC in Luxembourg that she used to funnel the rest of the Atlantic Estates sale, I later learned, through an intermediary in Providence who owed her loyalty and rent. That part I found with a forensic accountant a month later. Detective Louis Moreno from the state police showed up 38 minutes after I called, which in real time is a miracle. He's the kind of man who thumbs through things while you talk and makes you feel like a story is landing correctly. He took photos. He wrote down lot 23. He said, "Don't touch the painting," and I laughed because I'd wanted to wrap it in gold mylar and put it in a freezer. He asked the curator where the ward map was. She said conservation, and he said, "Great. Where?" She said, "In Lisbon." He looked at her like a windshield, looking back at weather. He pulled the building camera footage. At 07:12 that morning, a man in a green beanie wheeled a painting out on a dolly. At 07:23, a tube long enough for a map. At 07:31, the wrong painting came back in. License plate, Massachusetts Commercial, 6CQ719. Delivery from Providence, the guard log read. The guard had written, "Curator approved." He loves his job, but not enough to go to court over it. Detective Moreno called Atlantic Estates. A specialist there named Anouk van der Meer answered, a Dutch woman who moved to Providence for love and stayed for forgeries. She confirmed the consignment for Lot 23 came in as CW Foundation, that the curator had inspected the map on behalf of an institutional consignor, and that the cashier's check went to a CW Foundation P.O. box. "We were told it was a Accession from an educational partner," she said. "The paperwork looked legitimate." She sent the consignment form. We compared signatures. The curator's R in her surname had the wrong swoop in both. She had traced herself badly. This is the part where escalation gets personal. Within a day of the cops showing up, the curator started turning up near me like a shape the light makes when you don't blink. Tuesday morning, she was outside my apartment on Bayview Street, talking to nobody on the phone with the tone people use for gossip. Wednesday, she was in the coffee shop line behind me, asking the barista if the oat milk tasted more like almonds lately. Thursday, she was across from the museum in her car at 9 p.m. with the engine off. She texted me once, "How did she have my number?" "We're on the same side." I didn't reply. I kept a log, date, time, location, what she wore. I filed a harassment report with Harbor City PD. They rolled their eyes at the word curator and then looked at the binder and stopped rolling. The board did what boards do. They hired a white shoe law firm in Boston to conduct an independent review. They also did what boards sometimes don't do. They suspended the curator with pay and locked her out of her email. She went on Facebook and posted a black square with a caption about truth and process. Her fans wrote under it about women in leadership and witch hunts. I turned off my comments. I watered the plants in textile storage. I spoke to the FBI on a Wednesday afternoon and learned that art crime agents have the humor of people who handle objects that outlive wars. A month later, an agent from the FBI art crime team named Miguel Alvarez arrived with a portfolio bag and a laptop that looked older than it should have. He had flown up from New York because of a tip. The ward map had been shipped from Providence, not to Lisbon, but to a warehouse in Newark controlled by a freight forwarder who sometimes lost modern design lamps on paper and found them in Manhattan apartments. The map, he said, might be in New Jersey pretending to be in Europe. Positive turn, allies arrived from weird angles. A librarian named Martha at the Lisbon Associação de Museus confirmed via email in Portuguese that no incoming items from Harbour City were logged in any conservator's register. An archivist in Bruges, spelled with an S, replied, "Your invoice is fake. We always include a stamp. Also, we never call ourselves Archivio, that's Italian." Anouk in Providence emailed me after hours. "I've been fighting this kind of thing for years. I keep a folder called Fraud Parties." She forwarded messages from the Curator that said, "We can help you place lesser material if you expedite our consignments." Anouk wrote, "People who love paintings don't talk like shipping clerks." Miguel and Detective Moreno drove to Newark with a search warrant and came back with a tube containing the ward map, still in its original mat, edges worn like a good story. Miguel called me from the highway. "We got it," he said, "and I have a thing for you." The thing was the tube's label return address, CW Foundation, sender L. Grenville, her mother's maiden name. He sent me a photo. The handwriting on Grenville had the same wrong swoop on the R. The Curator was arrested on June 20, 2024, at 7:14 a.m., outside her rented brick house on Argo Lane in Harbour City. She posted bail by noon and held a press conference at 4 p.m. on the steps of the library because she understood optics. "I'm innocent," she said. "This is a vendetta." She called me disgruntled. My boss told me not to watch the clip. I watched it 3 times and then reshelved a box of ship manifests from 1830, because moving paper around sometimes feels like defiance. The charges were messy: larceny over 1,200, possession of stolen property, uttering false instruments, an attempted scheme to defraud. The U.S. attorney filed a separate charge for interstate transportation of stolen property because the map took a joyride through New Jersey. Her lawyer used the phrase de-accession ambiguity like it could water a fire. The board chair sent a letter to members that began, "This museum is more than one person," which is true and also always a consolation prize. She escalated one last time before quiet. She showed up at my mother's house in Mattapoisett, uninvited on a Sunday, with a Tupperware of foraged mushrooms and a note. "I'm sorry for the stress your child's choices are causing." My mother, who runs a daycare and can snap a crayon into regret without raising her voice, called the police and left the Tupperware on the porch for the squirrels. I filed for a harassment prevention order. The judge granted it with a face like a harbour wall in January. The trial was set for February 2025. In the meantime, she started a Substack called Museum Futures, in which she wrote about calcified institutions and the indignity of scarcity. Her fans sent money. The museum updated its vendor policy to say the words, "No consignments by staff-controlled entities," a sentence that feels like it should have always been there, like guardrails on a cliff. The positive turn wasn't dramatic. It was a Wednesday morning in July when the ward map came home. We laid it on the table with weights and humidity like prayer. Martha, in paper conservation, turned off her radio and hummed as she tested a corner of the lower right for pH and gum Arabic. She breathed, nodded. "It's fine," she said. "I wrote in the movement ledger 0717240943, ward map returned to drawer 12. Condition stable." Cassia brought coffee. We cried, not because of a trial or headlines, but because sometimes a thing you love comes back to the right drawer. The museum hired an interim director named Luis from Madrid who believes in budgets that tell the truth. He installed dual authorization for any movement out of storage, video at the loading dock that actually stores to the cloud, and a policy that says we will never invite trustees into storage during a storm. He also changed our de-accessioning process so it takes 6 signatures and a line from the Bible, "Restrain your hand until you're sure." He meant the policy. I like his emails. I like that they arrive at noon, not midnight. The trial started on February 3, 2025, in a crowded courtroom that smelled like stale heat and coffee. The prosecutor was a woman from Worcester who carried her pencils in a case that said evidence and made jurors feel like she would label their socks. She laid out the consignment forms, the wires, the forged R, the Newark warehouse, the phony invoices from Bruges and Lisbon, and the Atlantic Estates emails. The defense argued that my binder was over-interpretation by a pedant, and that the CW Foundation was a legitimate funding conduit for museum projects. The jury looked unimpressed with conduits. Anouk testified for the government. She wore black and spoke like flint. We believed the consignment represented a legal de-accession by an educational partner, she said. I have since adjusted my belief. The judge asked why the auction house didn't call the museum. Anouk said, we did. We were told that the curator was authorized to speak for them. The judge looked at the curator. The curator looked at the judge with eyes that might have once worked, but now only reflected. I testified after lunch on a Tuesday. I wore a jacket I borrowed from Cassia's husband because I own one blazer and it smells like thread. I took the stand and explained accession numbers, movement logs, humidity, and why a facsimile on cotton rag can fool donors, but not the left arm hair of a collection manager who hasn't slept well. I said, it isn't about market value, it's about trust. The defense asked if I had a personal vendetta against the defendant. I said, I have a vendetta against any person who writes over pencil they didn't earn. She pled to a lesser charge after a week of testimony. 3.5 years suspended, 200 hours community service, cataloguing municipal archives where nothing sells. Restitution of $68,000 to the museum. The net after Atlantic Estates recouped their fees and the freight forwarder paid a fine. And a ban on serving as a fiduciary for any non-profit for 10 years. She will probably write a book. The museum will probably not be in it. That is okay. We changed the way we do things. We added internal audits every quarter. We instituted a whistleblower policy that names the collection manager as a protected role. We banned private foundations owned by staff from transactions that involve the museum. And we put that into bylaws you can't charm. We also decided to bring the public into the back carefully. Twice a year, we open storage and let people see how humidities are kept, how paper lies, how paint cracks like creek beds. We show them the hard part of stewardship. People like to be told the truth, it turns out. They show up with pies and questions. The twist circles back to the scream and the door and the wrong frame. A year after the VIP tour meltdown, we held a small lecture in storage called The Right Drawer. I stood next to drawer 12 and told 30 people what pH paper does when it hates you. A child in the front row asked if maps get lonely. I said, not when you visit. The hygrometer read 50, perfect like a lie we earned. The door drifted open a crack in a lazy breeze. I put a stopper under it. The frame at the end of the aisle leaned slightly, properly, tagged with our accession number in my handwriting and in Cassia's database, barcoded, photographed, known. The dehumidifier hummed like contentment. I said, we stop tours now when something is wrong. And the room laughed the way people laugh when they recognize how they want to live. Nobody smiled like a lighting compliment. We didn't need to. The label said what it was supposed to say, and the right thing sat in the right drawer.